Welcome to the America's 360 podcast. Get the inside scoop and the outside perspective on the latest developments from Canada, Latin America, and everywhere in between. America's 360 is a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of America's 360. I'm your host, John Molesky, and this program is brought to you by the world's #1 think tank for regional studies, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And America's 360 is a collaboration among the center's Argentina Project, Brazil Institute, Canada Institute, Latin American Program, and Mexico Institute. Well, as we reach the end of the calendar year and the dawn of 2022, we thought it would be a good opportunity to ask our panel of experts to take a brief look back, but also a look ahead. What's on the horizon? Maybe they can help us flag the stories they'll be watching in the months ahead. So with that in mind, let's bring in our roundtable. Please say hello to Latin American Program Director Cindy Arnson.
Hey, John.
Brazil Institute Fellow Daniela Campbell.
Hello.
Mexico Institute Director Andrew Rudd.
Hi, John.
And Canada Institute Director Christopher Sands.
Hello, bonjour, John.
I want to welcome all of you back. Happy holidays, Happy New Year. Looking forward to hearing what you have to say. And, as I said in the introduction, this is an opportunity pretty much free form to tell us what's on your mind. What are the issues you're tracking? I know the Wilson Center has an annual publication called On the Horizon, and all of you have contributed to that in one way or another. So perhaps there'll be some overlap between what we talk about today and that document. But if we could, let's start in the snowy north with Chris Sands. Chris, what's the word from Canada?
Well, it's going to be an interesting year. We ended 2021 with a new government in Ottawa that has made the very important decision to adjust its fiscal approach to the COVID fight and begin ramping down benefits that were initially sort of emergency benefits and then recovery benefits to help workers who weren't drawing income because of the pandemic. A lot of economists have been saying in Canada that has dampened people going back to work and getting back into the regular economy. And so we're looking now at the beginning of sort of the tapering off of those benefits and hopefully a downturn in Canada's unemployment rate. There are labor shortages in a number of parts of Canada, and people will put out a vacancy and not be able to fill them. So there is growth potential, but they need to get those bodies into those jobs. And that's the first big thing. The second big thing is Canada spent so much on COVID recovery that it's now facing the twin dilemma of running out of money, raising taxes, or potentially facing inflation, much as other parts of the hemisphere are. And this is the #1 political issue. It's the issue on which conservatives and liberals and others are divided, because whether you taper back spending and then cut taxes and keep on the same fiscal level, or whether you increase taxes to pay back the benefit on a more aggressive scale and borrow less, these are the kind of decisions that are really animating Canada, at least around the COVID fight. A second big challenge is climate change. Canada is committed to net zero by 2050 and has made the commitment to meet their goals as aggressively as possible. And their main tool is increasing the carbon tax, which is currently at $50 a ton to $170 a ton, Canadian, mind you, but not US dollars, but still, that big an increase has a huge impact on other countries, particularly the US and Mexico, because Canada has also talked about border adjustment fees, which are allowable under the USMCA, but that would mean that they'd be adding costs to exports into Canada in order to equalize so that they can protect their own competitiveness, their own firms with those higher prices. But watch, as the border goes back to normal, you would see a lot of Canadians coming across the border so that they could buy products without having to pay a border adjustment fee. And at a time of inflation, something that big in terms of taxation has a huge potential economic impact. So from one end to the other, it's an economic story for Canada in the year to come and in the year we've just passed. Maybe one last thing, John, just because I'm thinking about it, China. Canada has come out of the deadlock they were in, having arrested Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei executive, on a U.S. warrant, and now she's returned to China, and China has returned the two Michaels, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, to Canada. The problem now is, how do you rebuild a relationship with China that has been damaged by this incident. And a lot of Canadians don't trust China. I think the government would love to see some outreach, but that's going to be very, very hard in the current environment. So I think China, in some ways, is the sleeper story of the year, but may by the end of the year turn out to be a pretty tough one.
I think, Andrew, you have a question for Chris.
Chris, I'll ask you the obvious question coming from the other side of the U.S. border, if you will. Maybe you could just say a little bit about North America, the North American Leaders Summit, and how that fits into Trudeau's plans.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating dynamic. We were so pleased to see North American Leader Summits come back, and often I think Canada and Mexico, I think some cases as well, prefer the bilateral dialogues with the U.S. because you can talk about all you have in common, and it's just the two. But in the trilateral context, I think both Canada and Mexico have been somewhat uncomfortable. But at the same time, Canada has been reassessing its view of the Biden administration, concerned that politics in Washington make it hard for the Biden administration to address some of the big pressing challenges they have. They're very concerned, for example, about subsidies in the current congressional legislation for electric vehicles that might only be available to vehicles made wholly in the United States. That's something that Congress has to decide. It's very hard for Canada to weigh in on. They've also been concerned about Line 5 and pipelines. Well, the interesting thing for Canada is I think they've started to see Mexico as a potential ally on these issues, and that Canada plus Mexico carries a bigger weight in Congress and elsewhere than either country by themselves. And that's what we've all been waiting for the North American triangle to be more of an equilateral triangle rather than an isosceles one with the really short end being Canada-Mexico. And so there's some potential there. And I think the North American Leaders Summit was a positive step in that direction. And it's the first one we've had since 2016, but definitely put Canada more in mind of what's going on in Mexico and the region.
Chris, when we pulling from the what could possibly go wrong file, is there one area that is of particular concern for the Canadian government?
Well, I think that one of the concerns really is that the U.S. has seen stronger job recovery growth, whereas Canada's not only been slower because of what they've done on the labor market side, it's also Canada's a heavily commodity-driven economy. And we started 2021 with a discussion of critical minerals, which Canada has in some abundance, but 1 year later, we still aren't seeing them pulled out of the ground. There's a lot of talk, not a lot of mining. We've seen oil prices at quite impressive levels, around $80 a barrel. Canada has plenty of oil, but because we didn't get the Keystone pipeline, because Line 5 is under threat and Line 3 is under threat, they can't sell it. And the only market they can sell to is the U.S. So they sell at a discount. So as commodities start to become important, that's part of the recovery of the global economy. Canada has them and can't get them to market. And when you look at the terrible weather in Vancouver, their whole West Coast market, their West Coast ports have been seriously constrained. Similar will be the case in the East because of snow and bad weather. I think Canadians are worried that there's a great opportunity for recovery and they won't have access to it because they don't have the infrastructure to get where they need to go. So the sleeper story there, and the problem with infrastructure is you can't build it overnight. It's going to be a long-term problem.
Yeah, right. Okay, thank you very much, Chris. Andrew, let's turn to you and get your thoughts.
Sure. Thanks, John. Well, 2021 marked with a new U.S. Administration a chance for sort of a reset in the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship, which under the Trump administration had really focused initially on trade and then ultimately really only on migration. And the Biden administration has tried with some success to broaden and reinstitutionalize that relationship. The creation of the reestablishment of the high-level economic dialogue in September and the high-level security dialogue in October, and then the NALS, the North American Leaders Summit that Chris just mentioned in November, were really the reconstruction of three longstanding institutions that hopefully provide areas to resolve both bilateral and trilateral issues, of which there are many. Some related to USMCA, some related to common challenges and common opportunities. So looking forward to 22 in the area of common challenges, first, I think has to be migration, which is an issue that the Biden administration came in trying to, and did in fact change some of the Trump administration policies, but Of course, we all remember the surges of migrants and the way that the issue has become politicized here in the States. Migration is going to be an issue for U.S.-Mexico in 22, and Cindy and Daniela will probably talk to this a little bit as well, but it's an issue for the whole hemisphere, and something that we'll all have to watch. Another shared challenge for U.S. and Mexico relates to security in terms of, for example, drug trafficking, the flow of fentanyl north, for example, using precursors from China, the flow of drugs, of guns and money back to Mexico. Those are issues that are critically important. And then institutions, democratic institutions in Mexico, which are under a lot of pressure from the current government, budget cuts, criticism of academic freedom, issues like that really are starting to call into question the strength of Mexican democracy. Not entirely different than what we're seeing here in this country, for that matter.
I wondered, in the U.S., when you talk about projections and trend lines, you often see public opinion surveys about how optimistic or pessimistic people are about the future. And we've seen contradiction in that regard in the U.S. We've seen fairly healthy economic recovery combined with fairly negative opinions about the future. Do we have similar measures in Mexico? What can you tell us about the zeitgeist?
It's interesting in Mexico because it sort of depends on who you talk to, which again is not different than here. I think the current government, the López Obrador government, is very optimistic about where they're going with their fourth transformation in Mexico, and very confident. But if you talk to a lot of folks in the business community, for example, you get a slightly different perspective, a lot of concerns that Mexico is not going to capitalize on the opportunities that may come from reshoring, or what is sometimes referred to as ally shoring or friend shoring. And much of that ties to the proposed energy reform, which will lead to higher electricity costs, as well as putting challenges on Mexico's ability to meet its climate change commitments.
Thanks, Andrew. Daniela Campello is next. Your thoughts?
There's no way to talk about Brazil next year without talking about elections, right? So we'll have presidential and legislative elections in the country, and they will happen in the middle of a lot of polarization, political polarization, and in the middle of an economic crisis. So Brazil has the fourth highest unemployment in the world. Incomes have fallen sharply after the cash transfer program of the government ended. We are with the levels of inflation that matched 2003 was the last time we had levels of inflation like this, when Lula was starting his government. So central bank will have to keep rising interest rates in the year of elections, which is always very nervous. I would say that there's a major concern, of course, about political instability. I think Bolsonaro has shown all the evidences that he will try to fight to remain in office, especially because he is absolutely sure that he will have problems with the law after he leaves. So the lower his popularity is, and it has been declining sharply recently, I think the higher the incentives for him to mess it up. So he has, after 3 months of some kind of calmness, he has been moving back towards talking against the Supreme Court, against the electronic vote, and going back to his original discourse. And this is what we should expect next year. One concern I have is that besides not only Bolsonaro, but the other candidates of what some people call the third way, which is Sérgio Moro, the judge of the Lava Jato, he has also been pointing out has been criticizing the Supreme Court in very similar ways to Bolsonaro. And the only reason for that is that the courts had overruled his decisions in the Lava Jato process. So we have 2 out of 3 candidates who are going to question and challenge the Supreme Court in the electoral year. So I think that should add to a lot of political instability. We shouldn't expect an easy path next year for Brazil.
How stable is the electoral system in terms of the confidence in counting votes?
There's a lot of confidence, and there was never anything that would point to fraud or any concrete claim about this. I think this is one. That's the way that Bolsonaro is dealing with the fact that he's most likely going to lose the election. But the thing is, not only he believes that, but some military that support him also believe that the Supreme Court favors one and another candidate. So this is the kind of thing that should be of a concern. It's not only him. He represents groups of people in Brazil that question the electoral vote. and question how solid the Supreme Court is in ruling elections. So that's
so much like what we've seen here in the U.S., where there's no,
except for the fact that the military are a big question mark in Brazil. It's not the U.S. So that we don't know exactly, not even specialists know exactly how far the military would go in this adventure. But the fact is, he has control of at least a part of the military. That thing. It's not that he created this story about the electronic votes. This was a belief among the military, and he represents this belief. So in that sense, I think it's a major concern compared to the U.S.
Okay, great. Thank you. Cindy Arnson, you're next. And Cindy, we sometimes, joke behind the scenes that based on your portfolio, that you have many nations to cover. But I want to acknowledge that publicly too. We really appreciate what you do for the team, and that you have the broadest section of geography to report on, and you do a great job with it. So thank you for that.
Great, John. Thanks for that. I think that one of the main stories from the Latin America, Caribbean region as a whole is to look at the very sort of intimate relationship between rates of vaccination and economic recovery. The latest figures from the World Bank predict that growth in 2021, 6% and change, is not even enough to make up for the losses in 2020, the first year of the pandemic. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of them has to do with the lack of vaccines until very recently throughout the region. It's really notable to point out that earlier this month, the Pan American Health Organization, which is the regional subsidiary of the World Health Organization, said that 20 out of 35 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean had yet to reach the target of having 40% of their population vaccinated by the end of 2021. So that gives you a sense of where Latin America is. It's obviously in a much better place than Africa, where you have less than 10% on average. But there's also just this huge variability, not only in economics, but also in politics. I mean, a country like Chile has about 84% of its population vaccinated. Uruguay, 76%. Guatemala, only 24%. So there's a great deal of variety. And I think what that has contributed to is an enormous frustration of average citizens against traditional parties and against incumbents. And you see that in the electoral outcomes thus far, not uniformly. Ecuador, somewhat of an outlier. You see it in the implosion of the center, if you will, in Chile, with the traditional parties of the so-called Concertación, the center left and center, and then also the center right parties that had occupied the political space since the transition from dictatorship. You see increasing authoritarianism in countries that already were headed in that direction, Nicaragua being the most extreme case, where an election was held in November with every one of the leading candidates, behind bars, which is really an extreme case. Venezuela, similarly, regional, mayoral, and gubernatorial elections, in which, the Maduro regime is contesting one of the governorships that the opposition won, one of three that the opposition won. Why? Because it's the birthplace of Hugo Chavez. So there's going to be a do-over, and nobody has any doubt that that election will go, towards the official candidate. El Salvador, similarly, attacks on civil society, on independent media, undermining of judicial independence, firing of judges, of prosecutors. Guatemala, totally extreme in terms of the crackdown against prosecutors who had been looking into cases of corruption, very, very well-known cases of corruption, the dismissal and exile, really, of the people that were in the forefront of that search. So it's been a really difficult and, if not ugly, time in many countries of the region. Obviously, some good news stories. Uruguay, Costa Rica, as they always are. Some bright spots, the digital economy, a renewed interest in greening the sources of energy, but still a lot of economic pain by a region that had become more middle class. In the decade of the 2000s, the commodities boom, now those hopes are dashed. And I think the mood of the electorate is just surly and dissatisfied and willing to take to the streets and protest on, in really sustained ways.
Cindy, is the main impact of those dashed hopes? Is it where governance meets the pandemic, or is it impossible to separate it out?
Well, it's difficult to separate primarily because 2019, which was before the pandemic, also saw a huge burst in
Mhm.
demonstrations, in social unrest in Chile, in Colombia, in Peru, in Ecuador, in Brazil, Venezuela, and it was very hard to tie it. In fact, it was impossible to tie it at the time to COVID, but it was possible to tie it to a period of very low, mediocre growth, so that the kinds of gains that the middle class had experienced, that the working class moving into the lower middle class, all of those gains were being eroded, at the same time that prices were continuing to rise and whatever. So there was just a lot of frustration going into COVID. Um, the initial lockdowns kind of pushed it all underground for a while, and now it's just in full bloom, not only in the streets but in the polling places.
Daniela, I know you want to say something about growth potential.
If I may add to what Cindy just said, there are two factors that matter a lot for economics, especially in South America, which is American interest rates, which we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but there may be a chance that they rise in 2022. That's very bad news for South America, Latin America in general. And the fact that commodity prices that rose 27% in 2021 are expected by the IMF to drop 1% in 2022. So this help from abroad is not going to happen in the next years. In the region, which is of major concern, I think. And I would point out, I think we should keep an eye on Chile's constitution, right? That it's going to be the final draft is going to be in mid 2022. An eye in Peru that there was a first attempt at impeachment of the president, and this may be not the last attempt at impeachment, so we should see more instability. And even in Ecuador, with the state of emergency, that Lasso will not have a chance of renewing because of the constitution, but we don't know exactly how he's going to respond to that in face of low popularity and a lot of resistance in the Congress. So difficult years ahead.
Andrew Rudman, I think Andrew has a question for you, Cindy, that I think has application globally, perhaps.
Cindy, as you were talking about the protests and demonstrations, I mean, do you think that the frustration is a threat to the democratic institutions, or is it just a demand for different leaders to run those institutions differently?
Well, I think you see both trends. Daniela mentioned, the constitutional reform in Chile, which is a direct response to the demonstrations that began in October of 2019. The newly elected president of Honduras, Xiomara Castro, has also called for a new constitution. Colombia, of course, which has seen lots of protest over the last, year and a half, 2 years, had a major constitutional reform in 1991, so you don't see it as much in the Colombian case. So I think it varies a lot, but it's certainly a frustration that is taken out by the population on the traditional parties, and traditional figures of what is referred to in Latin America as the political class. So there's a lot of move towards outsiders, as we saw with the election of Bolsonaro that many years ago. But you also see a doubling down by governments that were already authoritarian or wanted to be more authoritarian, really feeling that they can take these moves with impunity, that there is no cost, dismissing prosecutors who were looking into big corruption cases, or just dismissing, the Supreme Court and the Attorney General as Bukele did in El Salvador, because really, what's the counterweight? And some would argue that China and Russia are there in the background, but it is true that there are lots of different options for those countries that want to opt out of receiving U.S. assistance. It's just not as persuasive a tool as it was even a decade ago.
Well, on that cautionary note, we're going to end this discussion. Cindy, Chris, Andrew, Daniela, always a pleasure. Thank you, not just this week, but for all your contributions on America's 360 and beyond, your work at the Wilson Center. It's a privilege to work with you and to learn from you. And whatever happens in the new year, we're happy that we'll have all of you along to help guide us through as we sort it out. Happy New Year. This episode of America's 360 was produced by Oscar Cruz, Cecily Fasanella, and Zoe Reed, and Sam Caney-Menez. In addition to thanking our outstanding production team, we want to thank you for listening, with the hope that you'll join us again soon for our next episode. And until then, we wish you and yours a most happy and healthy holiday season. And as always, thank you for your time and interest. For America's 360 and the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. We'll see you next year.
You have been listening to America's 360, a podcast about the innumerable ties among the nations of the Western Hemisphere. You can subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. To learn more about our programs, please visit wilsoncenter.org. And please join us again next time for another episode of America's 360.